Recently, a video that's gone live on my Mackerel Undercover channel is Super MP Plays Even the Ocean. This is a new format of Let's Play. I don't mean that it's new in general, but I mean that it's new to me. I've taken many hours of footage and condensed them into a more tightly edited, and I hope more entertaining, type of Let's Play. If that might interest you, I suggest checking out that video before watching this review. I'll put a link to it in the description, and there should be like a little card popping up. Of course, the calls to action. You can follow me on Twitter at MackerelPhones or check out my website MackerelPhones.com, and of course, you can like this video, comment beneath it, and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell if you want to be notified when I upload new videos. Yeah. Anodyne holds a special place in my heart, so I was excited to try out the second video game from Analgesic Productions, the two-person team Melos Hantani and Marina Kataka, hopefully I'm saying that right, Even the Ocean, a story-focused side-scrolling platformer released in 2016. In a noble effort to unite story and gameplay, both focus on the theme of balance, specifically balance between the light and dark energies that are the focus of the fantasy setting's science and society. While the later Gauntlet levels become lengthy, Analgesic Productions give dialogue and character interactions priority by their sheer volume. My playthrough of Even the Ocean took about 10 hours. The gameplay loop consists of being assigned a series of missions to complete, walking to them on the overworld map, completing some tedious interactions with minor characters, and then running through the Gauntlet stage before returning to the central city Whiteforge and later Koravold to partake in some culture, or at least read some dialogue, and repeat the process. Most of the gauntlets are malfunctioning power plants, though so abstract in their designs that, in a setting full of concrete details and deliberate world building, I felt constantly distracted by the question of what these spaces were supposed to be, or who could have built them so irrationally. There are some enemies, strange creatures called spores, but the player character, the power plant technician Aleph, is not equipped for combat. As with the robots in Kneet Underground, these enemies are more in the character of obstacles. But obstacles there are aplenty. Aleph has no health bar, but instead a balance between light, that is green, and dark, that is purple, energy displayed at the bottom of the screen. Depending on their color, some obstacles, traps, and other features of the environment, primarily flowers, but also including lasers, mist, and the aforementioned spores, will raise Aleph's light or dark energy level. More dark energy allows Aleph to move more quickly horizontally, jumping longer to clear wider gaps, but not jumping as high. More light energy allows Aleph to jump farther and more quickly vertically, but more shortly and slowly horizontally. Different sections require both extremes. If the bar completely fills with either dark or light energy, however, Aleph's body becomes too unbalanced and she dies, returning the player to the previous checkpoint, non-diegetic statues of the black mage-like storyteller who narrates the adventure. Aleph also wields a salvage shield the player can, and must, use to block some energy blasts and, occasionally, to bounce off lasers and grind along rails. In the final section of the Gauntlet, the player will find, instead of a boss fight typical of the genre, poles with sliding lenses that break upon contact with light or dark energy concentrations. To complete each Gauntlet, the player must maneuver these lenses intact through more obstacles and into slots. In addition to timing, these segments have a puzzle aspect. The final step, a simple puzzle to redirect beams of light and dark energy, is trivial enough to warrant no further description. The initial Gauntlet levels are extremely easy, but the later ones become more challenging. Even so, Even the Ocean is never difficult, especially in comparison to the frantic broom combat of Anodyne. Outside of side-scrolling towns and gauntlets, Even the Ocean features a Dragon Quest-style overworld with a top-down perspective, super deformed character sprites the size of cities and mountains marching across an otherwise proportionate map. Without constant random encounters disrupting the explorative appeal, Even the Ocean, rather like Terranigma, with which it shares a number of thematic similarities, promises discovery. The player's ability to investigate any interesting objects and places seems poised to reveal so many secrets to flesh out this wide-open world full of towns and the occasional traveler. Unfortunately, none of this potential is realized. There's little hidden content. What there is, amounting to a few lines of dialogue from Aleph. There is, I think, only one optional area to visit. No quests will see Aleph return to towns she's gone to on the job, and returning to old areas never showed me any new scenes. Attempts to wander anywhere the plot, or rather Aleph's boss, doesn't demand the player be, result in Aleph shutting down exploration with a line like, "I should really get back to the city before doing anything else." As a result, the overworld, the numerous towns, and the enormous cast of underdeveloped characters, many of whom exist as vehicles for gentle and unfunny humor, feel more like padding between gauntlets and interactions with the few meaty members of the cast. Yara, Biggs, Wozniak, and, in the final two chapters, Humus, as well as a few other more substantial characters. On the second set of overworld maps, the Outer Continents, exploration at least becomes a better utilized mechanic as the player tries to locate the next gauntlets, but it's still too limited and makes the primary overworld map feel only more barren and underwhelming. What I have been describing is the full game mode. In an extraordinary touch, Analgesic Productions also includes Story Mode, which excises all these gauntlet levels, and Gauntlet, which takes out all the story. Warp is an additional option created specifically for people like me who want to skip around Even the Ocean at will to study it. As an effort from such a tiny studio, Even the Ocean is hugely impressive, with lush pixel art graphics, a beefy script featuring dozens of characters, and an enormous soundtrack unmistakably like that of Anodyne in instrumentation, but with the far less catchy and far more eerie and ethereal quality that has defined Hantani's post-Anodyne music. The Barely There soundtrack often blends so seamlessly into diegetic wind and chirping and whirring that it's difficult to determine what is music and what just sound. Despite a tragic opening act and frequent darkness, most of Even the Ocean maintains a mellow tone that, mixed with this gentle music, a slow pace, and the gradual escalation of tight and fun, if easy and bare-bones platforming, results in a relaxing experience. That is, until the last two of the 5 chapters when the plot swerves into horrifying territory. Even the Ocean is the rare platformer with a narrative focus. While competent, the platforming sections are so disconnected from the world building and action that, despite their focus on the balance theme and emphasis on defensive action, the shield, instead of offensive violence, they feel narratively expendable. They are at least expendable enough that Kitaka and Hantani welcome players to skip them. Although cutting these reflex-based challenges is great from an accessibility perspective, from the perspective of video game structure, if the interactive part can be removed with no change in meaning, the video game might be better off as a visual novel or comic. Even the Ocean is hardly the only video game guilty of this jarring disconnection. I'm looking at you, Final Fantasy 1 through 9, and probably also the others. But given the attempt to thematically blend the two aspects of the story's form, Even the Ocean is laudable. But my word choice is deliberate. It is a noble attempt. In comparison, a video game like Palace of Woe completely unites its story and gameplay to the point of inseparability. For there, the gameplay, overcoming challenges and sorting the environment to sort the protagonist's true identity from a melange of obstacles and confusion, is the story. For all of that, Even the Ocean is still an enjoyable, if not complicated, platformer. The centrality of narrative to Even the Ocean means story will be my focus for the rest of this review. If you don't want it spoiled, please do not keep listening. If in judging the story I seem harsh or nitpicky, please know that the criticism comes from a place of respect. In a video game with political themes striving for literary seriousness, I believe narrative scrutiny is far more worthwhile and necessary than in something more frivolous like Hinedere Beat, which I wrote a positive review of you can read on my website, as a self-plug there. For most of the plot, Aleph has little agency, obeying whatever orders she receives initially from Hastings, her boss who rapidly vanishes from the story, and then from Mayor Biggs and Dr. Wodsnick. However, I don't consider this a flaw. I'm skeptical of the traditional writing advice that a good protagonist must have substantial agency. Many of us in real life similarly spend most of our days powerless, or at least following other people's agendas. Aleph's obedience, and a bit of a good video game cliché dating back at least to Metal Gear, is also thematically relevant. In the end, the world is consigned to destruction because Aleph fails to interrogate the unjust and unsustainable power structures she serves. As Aleph says when the sky is red and she realizes every whimsical child and disgruntled clown she met is doomed, I don't know anything about anything. I just did what I was supposed to do. As is often the case, however, this falls somewhat flat when the player has no choice to ever not be complacent, though Analgesic Productions would correct this narrative shortcoming in their next release, Anodyne 2. The central metaphor about light and dark energy concerns two main subjects: hierarchical power structures and climate change. The Society of Whiteforge, the world's dominant city-state by far, is meant to parallel modern civilization with its militarism, class stratification, and climactic destruction. The entire story is framed as a warning to the real-world civilization here on Earth. Whiteforge proves unsustainable because it's fundamentally unjust, and because its effect on the environment guarantees a natural feedback loop akin to climate change, here taking the form of kaiju-like monsters called geomes and a global deluge. A bit more dramatic and immediate than what we're dealing with. Light energy is vertical. Its supremacy corresponds to hierarchy in the obvious class divides of Whiteforge. Dark energy is horizontal, associated with the soil and the presumably egalitarian tribes whose condescending descendants build Whiteforge. Aleph's relationships with these two types of energy and the social values they imply correspond, like the player's relationship to the Order and Chaos faction leaders in a Megaten game, to Mayor Biggs, light energy, and Yara, dark energy. Biggs's relationship to light energy is obvious. A literally lofty ruler, this politician with the coiffured hair of a cartoon bigshot inhabits the heights of the Whiteforge Apex District and presides over the power plants and the battle against the end of the world. Biggs is out of touch with the constituents and seems to lead a sexless life with no reference to any kind of partner. Yara, in comparison, is a poor queer woman close to the earth who labors in the soil and doesn't fear death, which she is close to from the beginning, first appearing eulogizing her late partner. The preview for Even the Ocean aligns characters with certain energies, and Yara is on the far dark energy side. Biggs, aloof even when he tries to be kind, uses Aleph for his propaganda and commands her to carry out missions. His dialogue portrait always marks him as Mayor Biggs, including his title to emphasize that he is Aleph's, and hence the player's, superior. In the last scene, Biggs tells Aleph that she is like a daughter to him, an inferior rather than a friend. Biggs is always hierarchical in his relationship to the player avatar. Yara, though grieving her girlfriend, is emotionally intimate with Aleph, cooks her meals, provides advice, hugs her as they both die, and, depending on how one reads the end of Act 3, might become her sexual partner, though in the ending Aleph still calls Yara only her friend. Yara is very much Aleph's reciprocal equal, rejecting her only when Aleph begins living in the Upper District. Much of Even the Ocean's political commentary is subtextual. Even the Ocean is set in a high fantasy world, one relatively mundane compared to, say, Lord of the Rings or The Legend of Zelda, but nonetheless not our own, with a distinct history and society. A strong class consciousness permeates Even the Ocean, made visible in sci-fi tradition through a difference in literal elevation in Whiteforge. The wealthy live in the white and blue levitating towers, balconies, and art museums of the Apex District, and the poor in the sprawling 1 to 3 story brown and gray buildings of the districts along the ground line, with settings like the garbage dump, but also with more egalitarian structures like the library. As Aleph says, the Apex District looks like the future, but is actually just a fraction of Whiteforge as a whole. Ground-level Whiteforge still houses the majority of the population, including me. However, this class metaphor doesn't quite succeed. While there is no other implication that colonialism ever existed in the world of Even the Ocean as it has in the real world, the class line is also racialized. The wealthy people of Whiteforge's Apex District, characters such as Wodsnick, Ronald, and Dave, are predominantly white, whereas almost every other person in the world, including Aleph, appears to be what folks would call a POC. Aleph is not Asian, because there is no Asia in this fictional world, but she is Asian-coded. In this subtextual narrative, Aleph becomes a kind of model minority class trader. After she completes the repair of the Fey Rouge power plant, Aleph finds herself summoned to meet Biggs, who lionizes her as a publicity stunt. Other characters and Aleph herself note that Biggs singling her out is so unusual, but Aleph artlessly ignores, mostly, that Biggs is using her. Later, Biggs rewards Aleph with an apartment in the Apex District, at the same time that he and Wodsnick let her in on the true scale of the threat to the world and the importance of her work. This spatial move corresponds to Aleph joining the upper class and implicitly accepting their values, even as her spacious apartment fails to bring her the comfort of her modest home in Murex Park. The move completely disconnects her from the community of Aloe, Yuka, and most especially Yara, who becomes hostile toward her in a pivotal scene in Act 3. In the subtext of the story, it is true that Aleph becomes a kind of model minority class trader, as I've stated. However, in the text, Yara comes off as irrationally mean in this scene. In particular, it seems bizarre that what really sets her off is Aleph wanting to save the world. "I have to do this," says Aleph. "I have to fight the Geomes. For Paxton. For Cassidy." At this point, both Paxton and Cassidy have lost their lives to the Geomes. Their deaths really do feel more somber than they would in a more fantastical video game. It's true that Biggs and Wodsnick are wrong about how to save the world. Yara intuits this, but at this point in the literal story, as opposed to the subtextual one, there is no reason to doubt that the Geomes are going to destroy the world. There is no evidence the leadership is wrong, except that Wodsnick is arrogant and lacks the emotional intelligence to respect Aleph's trauma. While Aleph may be somewhat insensitive to bring up Cassidy, it seems odd that Yara rejects the obvious fact that Cassidy did die for our way of life, i.e. a stratified class structure running off Whiteforge's power plants, and is angry to learn that a giant monster killed her partner? For Yara to be upset, Aleph should instead adopt the snobbishness and aloofness of the ruling class. She might comment on how small Yara's house now seems to her, or how underwhelming her kitchen appliances. Just something to make her actually warrant rejection besides passionately not wanting the human species to go extinct. Or Yara should have some solid reason to believe that it's wrong to fight the Geomes, or that Aleph is wrong to be involved in repairing the power plants. Maybe Yara could be part of some kind of countercultural or revolutionary organization that is skeptical of all of this and has gathered evidence that Biggs and Wodsnick are wrong. But instead, in Even the Ocean, having compassion for people who want to live is a vice because people are basically bad. Despite the centrality of class politics to the story, outside of the final scene, characters never explicitly mention wealth disparity. Where the metaphor of the unsustainability of class society connects with climate change is the revelation partway through Act 3 that the stakes of the story far exceed the interpersonal drama of a power plant technician. This occurs with the introduction of the geomes, as what is attacking the light energy power plants that fuel Whiteforge and our way of life. From the records of a lost civilization, Karavold, whose skyscrapers and cars resemble those of modern-day Earth, Biggs and Wodznik know there have been a series of other similar civilizations before Whiteforge. Each ended with the geomes appearing, and then an apocalyptic global flood or drought in an ongoing cycle of destruction and regrowth. Biggs, and in turn the obedient Aleph, believe that killing all three geomes will stop the coming flood. Nobody offers any alternative route until the finale, when the entire cast bafflingly, but as it turns out correctly, begins treating an obnoxious drifter named Humus as an immortal, inhuman being of great wisdom. Humus is an avatar for the Earth, not angry or wrathful, but just indifferent. Yara, who accepts Humus like Jane accepts nature as it is, more on Jane later, rather than Aleph, who, like Wodznik fleeing from greater knowledge to shore up his property, rejects Humus as impossible to understand, manages to get the mysterious drifter to reveal that the geomes had been out to weaken the flood by destroying the power plants. The severity of the flood, or drought, depending on the phase of the cycle, corresponds to the degree to which the civilization disturbs the balance of light and dark energy. This leads to a conclusion in which Aleph firmly sides with Yara to reject Biggs, who, despairing, attempts to keep the apex district of Whiteforge levitating to wait Noah-like for the flood to recede. This shocking abandonment of the poor, or not so shocking in light of the survivalist schemes of certain real-world rich thieves, marks Biggs's first and only genuine betrayal. This betrayal is not premeditated, though. It is an act of desperation by a weak man who doesn't know what's going on. The challenging final level has the player climbing the sunrise spire that is the symbol of Whiteforge, of the kind of progress that Biggs and Wodznik represent, to rebalance the light and dark energy, embracing dark energy to sink the apex district and avert the flood. The civilization of Whiteforge, then, is unsustainable because it upsets the balance of nature. Summarily shutting down the power plants would presumably kill thousands of people dependent on the electricity, but in the metaphor of white energy corresponding to a rigid, hierarchical society, this means Aleph, a working-class heroine, must rise up against the ruling class to, siding with Yara and dark energy, create a more horizontal, a more balanced society. Except that Aleph's gambit fails. All Aleph does is guarantee that literally everyone will drown. Biggs might have acted out of cowardice and with appalling inhumanity toward the poor, but somehow telling the upper class, including sympathetic characters like the museum tour guide Violet, that they must all die alongside the rest of us seems like the wrong solution? Maybe we should try and get as many people as possible into the Apex District? Even the ocean denies the player even the option to, say, travel north to try and save Aleph's mother instead, or find high ground. It also seems like the wrong ending to a story that up to this point comes off as largely unjudgmental. In this ending, the characters describe humanity as an invasive species destroying Earth. Humus inspires Yara to monologue about what has gone wrong and, in turn, the core message of the story, at least the intended core message. This notion of the violence of the ruling class is an irrational continuation of the survival of the fittest. In a society no longer requiring this competition, explicitly links light energy dependence to class society. However, this could also be read as implying that humanity should be in a state of constant war of all against all style violence. That reading is almost fascist and totally unrealistic. I'm also inclined to object to the suggestion that the world needs a little violent hierarchy to keep up the balance, as with Terranigma's incoherent treatment of light and dark as forces to be kept in balance, despite the dark in that story being unambiguously evil. Furthermore, this concedes the point. Human society exists in an ecosystem, or in many ecosystems, but it is not itself an ecosystem. I am not engaged with my neighbors in a violent life-or-death battle over resources to determine who reproduces, but I don't know what kind of life you might be leading. Aleph feels terrible guilt for having doomed the human species to near extinction and having murdered the entire cast, including dozens of children, but Yara shrugs it off. I know when you do something wrong, sometimes it feels like you have to pay by feeling bad enough somehow, like that's justice. But it's just not. This is fine advice for daily life. In context, however, it comes off as unutterably callous, as though Aleph is wrong even for feeling bad that everyone will die. Yet the story, here as elsewhere, implies Yara is the voice of moral authority. The story suggests humanity deserves it. Aleph describes the deluge in biblical terms as punishment for sin. There is, again, the parallel between power imbalance of the few and the many and the reliance on light energy. The issue, again, is that White Forge's injustice is subtext based on knowledge of how these systems work in real life. Yes, the player can tell class stratification exists in the world of Even the Ocean by the clear and racialized differences between the Apex and Ground districts, but most of Even the Ocean is too mellow to depict this greed and violence that damns humanity and shows that the way of life of White Forge is genuinely unjust. There are no cops, there are no soldiers, no war is occurring anywhere in the world. The prison, aside from Humus, seems empty. At no point do conquest, greed, or the corruption that concerns Aleph seem to exist. Poverty is romanticized, Yuka and her friends building wondrous and useful obstacle courses in the junkyard, Yara and Cassidy growing their own garden pure enough to summon the immortal Humus, and Aloe running a charming 7-Eleven-style store that sells her delicious home cooking. None of the downsides of poverty, deprivation of healthcare, lack of clean water, having to work multiple miserable jobs, and so forth, exist in Even the Ocean. Biggs, in a twist on the classic twist, is not a deceitful villain, but an honest, if unpleasant man, trying his best to save the world the only way he knows how. Most of the upper class, Dave, Athea, Gavin, Biggs, etc., are shallow, but even when they form an angry mob to pursue Humus, these social and economic elites, despite Dave being nasty to Yara, do not want to harm them, use no weapons, call no police, and accept an apparently non-violent solution. The most negative depiction of the wealthy by far is an optional throwaway character named Barton who, from annoyance, wants Aleph to murder the sentient starfish at Restview Beach. While Barton's cruelty is unconscionable, and it would say something about Aleph if the player agrees to go along with it, a lone scumbag on holiday doesn't make for a damning portrait of the abuse of power. The imperialism of White Forge appears primarily in the relatively minor form of a project in Oscar Basin to reshape the local culture to be like that of the big city, seemingly an effort by the vapid townsfolk and their mayor, a tragic Biggs wannabe named Chairman Vale, to appeal to investors. I call this imperialism relatively minor, not because it doesn't matter, But in contrast to, say, violent conquest or brutal labor exploitation of the periphery, the sequence is also used as comic relief, softening the conflict. There's a total absence of the cruelty of similar real-life projects. Not a single cop or soldier appears in Oscar Basin either. Is this really enough of an atrocity that everyone in the town, including Dolly, Vale's daughter who embraces direct action to combat this assimilation, warrants death? Should be considered completely corrupt or wielding violence unjustly and unnecessarily? What's the culture White Forge's financial power has erased? What has been lost? The player never learns, so it never seems too horrible. Jane, part of Wozniak's expedition that discovered Carivold prior to the events of Even the Ocean, all but states a more positive moral than the ending offers. Aleph responds, "Maybe you could have helped. Maybe we wouldn't be in this situation now." Even the Ocean implicitly critiques militarism then, critiques using only weapons and force to solve issues, in Biggs and Wozniak turning to violence to fight the geomes. This, as Jane makes explicit, is their fatal flaw. Upon learning about the geomes and the flood, Wozniak and his team halt their research into nature and archaeology to focus on consolidating White Forge's defense capabilities. If they had put science toward expanding knowledge instead of expanding military power, they might have learned the folly of their over-reliance on light energy. But again, this violence is not imperial, it doesn't seem to be class-based, it is strictly directed at giant inhuman monsters whom there's little reason to believe are not trying to attack innocent people. If the towers and guns Jane speaks of correspond to oppression, like real militarism, the player should witness some actual oppression. My reading may also recontextualize my earlier criticism of the overworld. Aleph has a world to explore, to learn all about like Jane does, or like the oddball Travel Bob does. The player is primed to look around, so Aleph may want to as well. But narrow obedience to White Forge comes first. No More Heroes is notorious for its realistically sprawling overworld full of almost nothing. While many consider this a shortcoming, the size acts as a humorous and bleak reflection of the wretched player character's complete failure to engage with anything in his community beyond nerd culture and mass murder. Far from a mistake, then, this is a meaningful design decision. Similarly, while I might not appreciate it, the overworld of Even the Ocean may serve a comparable purpose. However, this still doesn't explain the strange resolution. Why is the map so tiny? The world of Even the Ocean seems more kind, just, civil, and even balanced than the real one. If the concentration of power by the White Forge elite is really so corrupt and vicious, Analgesic Productions should show the player some of that corruption and viciousness. A video game set in a society that is grossly unjust, or in a society that might warrant such harsh judgment, would be fundamentally different and much nastier. There would probably be some combat for one, but the general compassion of Even the Ocean renders the ending incoherently harsh. I would take this cruelty as the crux of the tragedy, a display of how the most innocent pay for the guilt of the powerful. Were it not that the powerful seem mostly benign, and that, moreover, the authorial voice shares Yara and Aleph's misanthropic perspectives. For such a haunting ending, the lesson that we need more balance in life seems oddly facile. The central paradox of Even the Ocean is that it at once overflows with affection for a vast and diverse cast of people of all ages, colors, genders, and sexualities, all of whom are honest and operate in good faith, but it concludes by condemning absolutely every one of them. Yuka and her hard-working friends, Garrett, the dedicated but unnecessary bridge guard in Riverton, the couple Wesley and Myron who run the library in Magdal Woods. It condemns every one of them to death for having existed in an allegedly decadent society with unsustainable electricity generation, and seems to justify it. There is, however, an attempt to dodge nihilism by implying that a civilization that achieves a balance between these types of social organization might not destroy itself and the environment. To humus, and so to nature itself, individual actions are irrelevant. But waiting for the flood, Humus adds, I too have a limited perspective in the face of the sheer complexity of existence. Kataka and Hantani wisely want to avoid determinism. Yara follows up, I don't think we can ever really know what we have true control over, or what humans are capable of as a whole. And if we don't know, well, then there's some worth to fighting for things, even if they seem impossible, or trying to think of different paths in the face of what feels inevitable. But these feel like underwhelming cop-outs. They also seem to miss the real point. Even the Ocean depicts nature as consisting of a series of cycles: the drought, the flood, the drought, the flood, life, death, and birth. Despite the talk of corruption, the actual sin of Whiteforge's way of life, as actually depicted, is a failure to recognize what Jane points out, that civilization is not distinct from, but exists within nature. People, then, must change culture along with nature, instead of irrationally sticking to their irrational structures. Whether a milder flood would be survivable is unclear, so this point too is ambiguous, but the clearest representation of this point comes from, ironically, Chairman Vale, before Whiteforge corrupts him. Describing, to his comically oblivious daughter, why the water in a fountain in the tundra flows instead of freezing solid, he says, the water doesn't freeze because it's always in motion, always cycling. Vale admits that the fountain is also heated, indicating that a responsible use of technology is possible, as I hope people making video games would believe. But after Vale ossifies into Whiteforge's mold and his community rejects all negative emotions, he stops going on walks and forgets the fountain, which malfunctions and freezes. Dolly's friend, Tracy, points out to her that the expanded water will rupture the pipes. Not only frozen, the fountain is irreparable. The fountain corresponds to the Whiteforge civilization. To spur adaptation and change is the real goal behind the Geome's intervention, and Whiteforge blocking change is the real reason for its destruction. At least that better aligns with the actual in-game events. Instead of embracing oblivion, humanity must realize their civilization is part of the Earth, and adapt and change that civilization with the cycles of nature, in this way also revitalizing their culture. And instead of fearing change, and even fearing death, they must accept that these are part of existence in an ever-fluid universe, a universe where all things change. Though I'll be honest, I still fear death. That Aleph comes far too late to effect positive change might suggest the authorial perspective on the current state of the real world. It is too late. Or perhaps Yara is correct and Aleph's actions, despite appearances, couldn't have mattered much anyway. But that's a flaw inherent to any story that attributes world-changing events to a lone hero. Carlisle, get out of here! Anodyne 2 follows and even intensifies Even the Ocean's concerning association of positive moral character with wanting to die, though at least in Anodyne 2, Kataka and Hantani depict the player's hierarchical death-fearing boss as legitimately cruel and ill-intentioned, instead of, like Biggs and compatriots, somewhat arrogant but well-meaning. As much as I wish I could say I enjoyed Even the Ocean, the experience feels pleasanter as a memory than when I held the controller. I remember Even the Ocean as a mellow platformer and frustrating, terrifying political story about the apocalypse. but while playing it, I was usually bored with prolonged, forgettable interactions with bit characters, and disappointed by an unrelenting linearity. But an intriguing and heartfelt, if flawed video game is always preferable to a boring one, or to highly polished hollowness.